everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. Today on the podcast, I'm excited to introduce you to Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jay Patrich, making his debut on At the Boundary. He'll be talking with fellow Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Humpal about a potential national security crisis he experienced while stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in 2022, when an aging, vulnerable electrical substation was attacked and left 45,000 people without power for 5 days. More on that in a moment. First, we wanted to share the release of a new documentary from our colleagues at Cyber Florida, premiering next week here at USF. It tells the year-long story of CyberHerd, a student group here at the university. These students are, in a word, hackers. And they're really, really good. The group is only 18 months old, and they're already capturing gold medals and first-place trophies around the country, most recently at DEF CON 33, the world's #1 hacking conference. The premiere is at the Oval Theater on the USF Tampa campus on September 24th. Admission is free, but you do need to reserve your seat. We'll drop a link in the show notes. Congratulations also to GNSI Senior Faculty Fellow and USF Associate Professor Zacharias Pieri. His latest book, Governance, Grievance, and Violent Extremism in West Africa, hit the shelves recently. Co-authored with Kevin Friddy of the University of Tampa, the book focuses on a region of the earth that has endured violence and turmoil for decades, but in the past 10 years has seen that violence escalate to unprecedented levels. Okay, let's turn our attention now to this week's featured interview. Joining us today are Air Force Lieutenant Colonels Jay Patrich and Jesse Humpal. Jay is also an important new member of the GNSI team as our first GNSI National Security Research Fellow. He's the first of what will be a long line of military officers expanding their professional military education through GNSI and USF. He'll be talking today with Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Humpal, an associate professor at my alma mater, the United States Air Force Academy, about his latest article, Transformer Trouble and the National Security Imperative. That article, published earlier this summer, underscores a disturbing vulnerability in America's infrastructure, an aging grid of electrical transformers that can be attacked and disabled by a wide variety of attacks, both virtual and kinetic, with devastating effect. Let's listen in as these two discuss this escalating threat to national security today on At the Boundary.
Hey, Jesse, thank you for meeting with me today. I appreciate the time. Today, we're going to talk about the couple articles that you've been had published on War on the Rocks. One about transformer infrastructure and another about position navigation and timing. So I want to talk first about your article, Transformer Trouble and the National Security Imperative, which arose from an attack on some electrical infrastructure in Moore County, where we both have lived. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So America's transformer infrastructure is vulnerable, and it's vulnerable for a lot of reasons. On the domestic side, naturally, it's aging. So the average transformer is over 40 years old, and it was built for a time that was without data centers at the now electric vehicles and AI-powered machinery. So they're just not set up for that. And to step back a second, transformers are pieces of equipment often embedded in electrical substations that upgrade or downgrade power voltage. So they're incredibly important, and we rely on them a lot. So as I said, we're vulnerable for 2 points. First is the domestic issue, but also they're vulnerable from a national security perspective, both from foreign adversaries targeting it both kinetically and with cyber attacks, but also from domestic extremists that can use low power rifles to take out whole cities. And you mentioned Moore County, where you and I both live, but I lived through one of these where one assailant with one rifle was able to take power out for 40,000 people for about 5 days. And this was not sophisticated, and it was to settle a grievance. So we're in trouble in the United States with how we protect, build, and project our transformer fleet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know most bases are primarily on what we call shore power, so integrated into the civilian power grid. And I can imagine, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan kicks off, and we suffer rolling blackouts across California. What do you think that needs to be done about this?
Okay, so to address your first point more directly, 99% of our United States military bases rely on local power. So they have backups, of course, but a sustained blackout that you mentioned would be incredibly devastating to our ability to power project, but also just to maintain readiness for sustained combat. To protect it, I think there's three or four different things that are very pragmatic and very practical to do. First, we need to build in resilience to the systems we already have, and that means starting to build a virtual reserve that can rapidly replace aging parts or destroyed parts. Because what we've learned from the war in Ukraine, where Russia has really attacked their critical infrastructure, that resilience and being able to like rapidly restore power is much better tactic and in the long-term strategic view than simply rebuilding or building entire new systems. The problem with the United States is that each one of our large transformers are very bespoke. They're custom made and they take a lot of time to rebuild. So one of the things that I'm arguing for is the United States should mandate modular units where they can plug and play different parts. And the Department of Energy is working on kind of piecemealing this together, but it's going to take a whole nation approach. The other issue is that we have a workforce problem where it takes 7 years for an electrician to come out of school to be able to build one of these transformers. So we need to really invest in our education and our workforce to be able to allow them, to give them the opportunities to be able to build these in the first place. Because these large transformers, if a city were to order one today, it would take approximately 4 years to deliver. And that's about 4x the amount of time that it took just 5 years ago. Part of that is workforce, like I said, but part of it is the tariffs that the current administration is putting on with the steel, but also previous administration issues with clean energy and environmental concerns. So the United States, put restrictions on how to build these things. And that has made it much more difficult to source the raw material and to build it in a way that can rapidly to backfill the ones that we already have.
So you're mentioning that we need to be able to build these faster to replace them when they go down. Are there other ways that the infrastructure could be more resilient? Is it just replacement rate, or is there better monitoring? Is there some way? I think you advocate that we need to be able to absorb the impacts and recover quickly as opposed to defend from them. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was an article that came about 30 days before mine that really advocated for being able to protect the grid, both physically, because most of these transformers are protected by a chain link fence and some cameras, and they're not monitored 100% of the time. So they're incredibly vulnerable to physical attack, but also they're not monitored from a cyber capacity. One of the, when there was less restrictions on importing some of these electric components from China, the United States found that there were backdoors embedded them in already. So it is very reasonable to say that they are already susceptible to some kind of espionage or backdoor cyber attack that could affect those. So increased surveillance and monitoring both in the cyber sector and in the just like the physical space would go a long way, but that's not going to be enough. I noted in the paper that there was a GSA report that came out that said 9 strategic takeouts of transformers could put the entire United States into a blackout for up to 18 months, which is incredibly dangerous. So we need to understand that the downstream effects of some of these blackouts that could happen, and be able to rapidly rebuild transformers if we were under an attack situation. So That includes the modular units that I discussed. So if one comes offline, we cannot wait for others to come offline because of the domino effect that could take place. So it's going to be a combination of physically securing it, but also having an ability to repair quickly before it becomes out of hand.
Yeah, better security, quicker recovery. Did you include the vulnerabilities in SCADA systems, so that's supervised control and data acquisition, effectively the software that runs everything? Because it seems like using malicious code to simply turn off transformers has the same effect as shooting them. Did you include any of that in your research?
I touched on it a little bit, and I advocated for several policy recommendations that can do it. So the kind of the catch-22 in it is that one way that we can rapidly produce transformer production in the United States is to declare it an emergency, similar to what the Biden administration did with the CHIPS Act, to onshore much of the chip production. We need to do the similar thing. I'm advocating that we need to do similar things for domestic transformers, including temporarily reducing restrictions on the environmental requirements for these, so we can rapidly build up our stockpile. With that, we still need to increase our security, our cybersecurity points of concern that you touched on, to make sure that we can not only detect but evict malicious actors that may be in plain sight. Similar to this, while I was on the National Security Council, which I hope to touch on a little bit later, we found Iranian PRC and Russia actors in various pieces of critical infrastructure, and identification was just one of the problems. This included water systems and things like that. But being able to rapidly evict them is a completely different problem that the government is not solely able to do, and doesn't have all the experts. So it's a really big public-private partnership opportunity that I think would be keen for the current administration to kind of take on and advance.
Jesse, you mentioned your time on the National Security Council. I find that really interesting. And I know that while you got to work on the NSC, you also produced an article on integrating with Chinese position navigation and timing, entitled "A Signal Point of Failure, Integrating BIDO into U.S. Position Navigation and Timing Systems." I'd like to hear more about that. And personally, I think that more scholarly research needs to include puns.
I agree, and I would love to brainstorm some puns at the end of this podcast, but more germane to the article at hand. Yeah, while I was at the NSC, I was director for resilience and the resilience and response director, and part of our mandate and part of my portfolio was to build resilience into our position navigation and timing, which primarily for the United States is GPS, and we are both a single point of failure. We use GPS for our positioning, but more specifically our timing, so our financial sector, our shipping, and things like that. And we are incredibly vulnerable to GPS. It is still the best GNSS system in the world, but the rest of the world is rapidly catching up. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to integrate not only with our friends. So EU has a system similar to GPS that's called Galileo, which we already integrate with quite a bit. But China actually is rapidly catching up to GPS and has the second best global system for positioning, navigation, and timing. And that's BeiDou, as the title suggests in my piece.
You mentioned in the piece, that this proposal, which is primarily, or at least, or maybe exclusively civilian in nature, contributes to deterrence. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen in public reporting that Russia and China, as part of their theory of victory, if there was a high-end war, is to blind or try to disable our global systems. And while the military portion of GPS is incredibly hardened and is protected, and there's redundancies in place, the civilian sectors that rely on PNT just as much, because is incredibly vulnerable and has this single point of failure. Why this is so critical is because of all the critical infrastructure sectors, besides the defense, well, including the defense industrial base, 80% of this is privately owned and operated. So it is very difficult for the government to mandate these redundant efforts, but it is possible, and it's going to be a policy decision. By integrating BeiDou, or requiring companies to integrate BeiDou who are in the critical infrastructure sector, will double the amount of satellites that they have access to, decrease dead spots, and add a layer of deterrence, because it will no longer allow a country, an adversary, to simply take out our global systems and then shut down our entire critical infrastructure network. It'll make it much more complicated, and it'll actually promote peace in the long run, is what my argument is.
Okay. To integrate Chinese PNT would involve different hardware integration than we currently have. Do you have any concerns about intelligence collection, malicious code from this hardware, which would undoubtedly be Chinese in origin?
So I think that's a bit of a misnomer. Almost none of these systems would require hardware swaps. And in the case that they would, it would be simply like a chip. It would be like a single chip switch, because most modern GNSS receivers are multi-channel, which allow them to tap into several different satellites. For instance, almost all major US handset carriers, Apple, Google, Samsung, they already use multi-GNS constellations to improve performance. So what I'm advocating for U.S. critical infrastructure has already been vetted and already is done. In the few cases that there would have to be a change in hardware on one of these critical infrastructure sectors, you could use an American-made swap out, and it wouldn't require any new Chinese products to be integrated into our systems. Also, by doing this, BeiDou is and what we would use BeiDou for is a one-way signal that would essentially make it non-existent ability to enter backdoors or enter our critical infrastructure. The thing that people are concerned with, and rightfully so, is that the PRC could, if they chose to, spoof the signals that came down to the critical infrastructure. They could also geofence it, so they could actually take it away without any kind of kinetic thing. But that would put us in the exact same spot that we already are on the single point using GPS with the back of Galileo.
Do you think there's any military application for this?
I don't think there's. At the current state of things, I wouldn't advocate for integrating BeiDou into any of our military systems. However, I think there is a military application and a logic to integrating BeiDou into our civilian critical infrastructure, and that is through the international relations kind of school of entanglement. So the more systems that are integrated and are interwoven between one country and its adversary, the less likely those countries are to escalate to a conflict. We saw this in the Cold War, but I also think it's important, and we see it in financial sectors and trade and things like that, where there's kind of a mixed view. One, we want to integrate with China because it's less likely if one of us goes down, the other will go down. But also you see people that are de-risking. So supply chains are moving out of China, or they're diversifying supply chains. I think that's good, and it's a good way to build resilience into their supply chain. But there's also a lot of deterrence benefit from integrating with them, because as much as we rely on them for manufacturing and things like that, they rely on us to purchase. And this is one other thing, small step, that will allow civilians to integrate and work together and build resilience for both countries in the long run, which I think is a positive thing in the grand strategic vision of what we're trying to do as a country and a globe.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Hey, Jesse, I know you got more work coming out that I haven't been able to read yet. Can you give me some previews? Yeah,
so when I was working on critical infrastructure, there were a lot of proposals to build in either resilience, security, or protection laws to protect these critical infrastructure. But what I found is that we don't really know if those are working. So one paper that I have in review right now is trying to understand if critical infrastructure protection laws are actually doing anything. What I found is there's a lot of data available for these new laws that came on the books a couple of years ago that really, it's kind of like drug-free zones in schools, where they bump up fines and prison sentences if you sell drugs in a school zone. Critical infrastructure protection laws are very similar to that, where if you mess with critical infrastructure like they did in Moore County, it's not just simple vandalism. It bumps up the fines and prison time that come with those. About half the states have adopted these critical infrastructure protection laws, but no one is looking at, that I can see, if these laws are actually providing a deterrent effect. Deterrence is notoriously difficult to measure, but when there's this variance in the United States with only half the states adopting them, we're really able to see if these laws are having a deterrent factor. Because the data is available, I was able to run a pretty big data set with like almost over 9,000 points that I was able to analyze. And I found that when these laws are put in place, there's about a 27% reduction in attacks on critical infrastructure, suggesting that this law and deterrent value is there. So it really provides some policy recommendations, and also just some clear evidence that for a low cost of adding additional protection and laws, you can actually deter attacks on this critical infrastructure.
That sounds really productive, especially when layered on the first, more resilience and everything. And also, it sounds like you're working on a way to measure deterrence, which I'm looking forward to reading and you collecting your Nobel Prize when you finally figure that out. Are you working on anything else?
Yeah, one other one is that about a week after the Moore County attack on the grid, there was another attack on a grid in the Pacific Northwest that took about 5,000 people out of power for about a week also. And then there was another one a week later. And I thought that was interesting because other crimes and other acts of violence are contagious. And we see copycats a lot because they see the news and things coming from that. So I want to quantify that observation and looking if, one, demonstrations against critical infrastructure. So we see a lot of this with pipelines, railways, water systems and stuff like that are actually contagious. And again, much like the Laws Project, there's a lot of good data and a lot of that goes back. And because the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Energy and these other places, they are really, really good record keepers, which makes for really good quantitative analysis. So I want to see how contagious these are, and if there's anything that we can look into this that makes these more contagious, and make policy recommendations for media recommendations, and then also law enforcement.
Well, I hope that's really effective, man, because I think people don't acknowledge or choose not to think about the national terror that could be caused by these massive blackouts. Just the relatively small one in Moore County was fundamental. It was disastrous for a lot of people, and it was sort of shocking. All right, Jesse, thank you for spending some time with me. I really appreciate learning about your research a little bit more and getting to spend some time on you. Any last bits?
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate the flexibility, and I like what y'all are doing there. So anytime that I can be an assistant, either on air, behind the scenes, I'd be happy to support. So thank you for the time.
I'm looking forward to talking to you again when your next articles come out.
Can't wait.
Special thanks to our guests today, Air Force Lieutenant Colonels Jay Patrich and Jesse Humpal, an associate professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, who lived through the very type of domestic attack he wrote about in his latest article, Transformer Trouble and the National Security Imperative. Their discussion brings into focus with total clarity how intertwined U.S. national security is with our aging electrical network. Patrich is the first member of GNSI's National Security Research Fellowship, and we're looking forward to even more from him in the future as he continues his work here at GNSI. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall, just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the boundary.